Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a book review of the horror novel The Violence by Delilah S. Dawson. This is a standalone horror novel by Ms. Dawson. She's also written a lot of books that I've read. She wrote the Star Wars books Phasma and Blackspire, which I loved. And she also wrote Hit and Strike, the YA novels that I loved. She wrote The Kill the Farm Boy with Kevin Hearn, which I didn't like that one too much. But so overall, I really enjoy her writing style. And this book has her writing style all over it. You're going to see me referencing my notes a lot in this review, and that is because this is a very difficult book to talk about. And so I want to make sure I get everything right. I'm basically reading a prepared statement as this review, so rather than me just talking off the cuff a lot like I am right now, I'm going to, for the duration of this review, very much read word for word what my review says on Goodreads, because I do not want to say the wrong thing, because I think this is a very difficult book to talk about. So why don't I jump right in? I think that this is a very difficult book to read because it is very disturbing in places, it's very visceral in places, and it is filled throughout with more heart than any other novels that I've read. In fact, I would say this is the most hard-hitting book that I've read since I read Beartown a few years ago by Frederick Bachman. And that is honestly one of the highest compliments I could possibly give this book. First of all, this book is about dealing with domestic abuse and violence. If you feel uncomfortable reading about that, then this would probably not be the book for you. It is not a subject I would necessarily seek out, but it was a very good expansion of my literary vocabulary and added some unique understanding to my perspective. I think that for anyone who has gone through abuse, this might be a difficult read, but it also might just be therapeutic to you, which is why I might recommend it. It depends on how you're feeling about this. Secondly, this book is shelved in the horror section of some bookstores and on Goodreads, and in others it's just general fiction. This book deals with a new pandemic, and although this one is about a virus that caused people to go on murderous rampages, there are elements of grotesqueness in this book, and I was mentally prepared for it to get a whole lot worse than it actually was. I think that this is more of like a soft horror novel, almost what I would consider a thriller. The first act of this book is by far the hardest to read. In the first act of this book, we read about 3 women who are dealing with terrible men in their life. Ella has an abusive boyfriend. Chelsea has an abusive husband. And Patricia has a philandering jerk for a husband. Boy, is this going to get demonetized. The whole book is about their experiences and their coping and dealing with domestic abuse, as well as the pandemic of the violence. Unless I missed something, every chapter is from one of these 3 women's unique perspectives. And they were all very interesting point of view characters. I think my favorite was Ella. I think that she had the most interesting perspective, but all 3 women had great perspectives, and I was hooked for all of them. Because the first act is so focused on domestic violence that these women deal with, it serves as the most grounded section of the book, and as I mentioned earlier, it is very hard to read. However, the second and third acts read more like an apocalyptic thriller story. In fact, if you've read Delilah Dawson's Hit and Strike books, the second portion of this book feels just like those books, but from a third-person perspective and with 3 main characters instead of 1 main character. I would actually say that if you can read those books and still come out enjoying them, you will probably enjoy this book, or at least tolerate it. You just have to push through the first 100 pages, which have the most disturbing elements. The first act of this book truly is like when it is at its most horrifying, and then it becomes a typical apocalyptic thriller in the second couple of acts. But this book is a very fast read, incredibly fast. I was able to finish off the book in only 2 days, and this is a beefy book. This is about 500 pages long, but I was able to read it really quickly. I read 150 pages the first day, and I read 350 pages the second day. I think this is due to the fact that Delilah Dawson is an excellent plotter, and the plot of this book leaves you on the edge of your seat throughout. When I put this book down, it was because I had to, not because I wanted to. I just had to keep reading and find out what would happen next. Talking about the themes here is going to be difficult, so I'm going to have to add some caveats and some expectations before I get into them. This will take a little second, so hold on. First, I am a man, obviously, and thus have a very different perspective than Delilah Dawson has on these issues. I have also been in a very loving home, and Delilah Dawson, as mentioned in this book, grew up in an abusive home, so I cannot relate to her on some of her experiences, although she does a good job of making the audience try to relate to her characters. Number 2, this book comes from a very liberal feminist perspective. There are dialogue moments from characters, and even the narrator saying, F the patriarchy. I obviously have cleaned it up for, This is obviously an incredibly different perspective than I have, and thus I bristled throughout at the worldviews portrayed by Dawson. If you are someone where the sentiments that I have discussed here are going to make you angry and would potentially ruin the book for you and cause you to rant about the book, I advise you not to read this book. Perhaps this is a book you should just steer clear. As a very conservative individual, I was able to move on when Delilah Dawson's worldview was present, and I was able to empathize not only with what her characters were saying, but also what she was trying to say as the author. All right, those are my caveats before I talk about the themes. Let's dive into them. This book is, as I mentioned, about 3 women overcoming the abusive relationships in their lives. As such, the themes of independence and also the themes of liberation and feminism are very much present. On that note, there are times that Delilah Dawson lays it on pretty thick, and I think that it is okay in this particular example. I am not always a big fan of authors including their worldview, especially when it feels like they're attacking for it. And usually I have a problem when the author limits the audience to a very limited few people. But I think in this case, the way that she's handled it, I think you can still read it if you're not from her perspective. And I also believe that she doesn't limit her audience too much here, because someone like me can still read and enjoy the book. I think it's okay because this really is almost like a liberal feministic manifesto of sorts, but in a fictionalized form. Speaking of laying it on thick, I need to address my biggest problem with the book. Almost all of the men in this book are cruel, despicable jerks. Absolutely horrible. In fact, I would go so far as to say that some of them are just evil. A few of them in particular, they are portrayed so horribly in this book. It was very frustrating to read through a book like this, where all the women are portrayed in a good light and all the men are portrayed in a bad light. This is the one place where I think the movie Don't Worry Darling actually suffered from the same problem. Now, I should caveat that there is one good and honorable character in this book who mostly shows up in the last act, and that is the character named Harlan. And I won't get into who he is or what he does, but suffice to say, he was far and away my favorite side character in this book. I wish characters like him were included earlier in the book to give more depth and to show that there are men who are honorable. Nonetheless, Dawson was writing a feministic manifesto, so it was understandable that it felt very lopsided here. I, of course, would write it very differently, and there are a number of ways that I think the book could have been changed. Particularly the language. There's some very coarse language throughout. The references to the corona virus, I won't say the name on here because I don't know how YouTube's dealing with that, but that virus, it should have just been called The Last Pandemic, because that would have made it more nebulous, and that would have made it more universal in its application, and reading 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, this book could have more universality to it, and instead, because she tries to make it specifically about the coronavirus, she limits the audience there. And I also think she should have had more good male characters. More good male characters. There were plenty of male characters, they just all were horrible men. Won't use the A word for them, but they were all horrible men. However, those changes, particularly the last one, would have detracted from what Dawson was trying to do in the book. So I completely understand why she wrote the book the way she wrote it, and I'm not really going to complain about it. I'm just going to say this is what I would have done differently, but I'm okay with the way she wrote this. I did very much call exactly how the ending would be going down, and beat for beat figured out what the ending couple of scenes were going to be. However, there is one thing that is unresolved between the mother and the grandmother in this book, and it is referenced in the epilogue, but we don't see their reunion scene, and that absolutely needed to be seen. I think that Delilah Dawson missed an opportunity to have therapy for the audience members who have had difficult relationships with their parents and even unabusive parents. I will say that reading books like this and books like Beartown by Frederick Bachman have given me a more developed sense of empathy for those who have been abused. I stated earlier that I disagree a lot with Delilah Dawson's worldview, but I can learn empathy and understanding anyway. So overall, this was a brilliant novel. Obviously, I have a few personal issues with it, and also a few minor issues with the storytelling, but it really is a well-produced and, dare I say it, entertaining novel that I think will relate to some people really well and will really be serving as a therapeutic book for a lot of people from a lot of backgrounds. It certainly narrows its audience at times with the way that Delilah Dawson portrays her worldview, but that's okay, because this book was written with a specific audience, with a specific intent, and with a specific manifesto quality to it. And so I understand it and am okay with the way it was written. But I actually, from like a grading scale perspective, I would give this book a 9 out of 10. I know that's shocking for me. I'm not a big horror fan. I'm not a big fan of authors who really put their worldview front and centers like this, but I was really impressed by this book. I saw so many naysayers about this book, and I've always been a big Delilah Dawson fan, and her writing style is always entertaining, and her writing style really jives with me for some reason, and it works here, particularly in Act 2 and Act 3. So I give this a 9 out of 10. I thought this was a well-done book. If you've read this book, let me know your thoughts about it down below in the comments section. If you haven't read this book but are interested, let me know those thoughts as well. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.